uh, who gave us a tour and an update on the renovation and the rehabilitation of the Amador Hotel. Tonight we have Katherine Masoth, who is an assistant professor of history at the University of New Mexico. Go Lobos. She received her PhD and MA in history from the University of Iowa and 2 Bachelor of Arts degrees in history and social science secondary education from the University of California at Irvine. Her manuscript, Keeping House, The Borders of Gender Roles, Cultural Practice, and Domesticity in Territorial Arizona and New Mexico, is under advanced contract with the David J. Weber series in the New Borderlands History from the University of North Carolina Press. Tonight, she's here to present on the title disappeared. The Amador women and kin work across the Mesilla Valley. So we can put our hands together and welcome Dr. Masoth.
Thank you, everyone. Can you guys hear me? No. Now, can you hear me? No. Now? Speak up. I can project. I'm a professor. This is what I have to do all day. Okay, welcome everyone. You guys are getting a good treat. What I've done for tonight is I have taken what is chapter 2 of my book, and I've distilled it down to kind of the funnest parts, but also the parts that I can enlarge in a way. Thank you, Dennis. To move us from Doña Ana County and Las Cruces and the Amadors, but to place it in a larger context, because as a historian, I know it's important to look at the local context and place it in a larger national context. So what I want to do tonight is we're going to kind of jump from the local to the national, back and forth, because I want to explain that Las Cruces and the Amador family, when we understand their history, we actually cannot understand their history without understanding Mexican history, US history, and also the history of the Camino Real, and the history of women and kin and labor. Okay, everything, is it working, Dennis? Perfect. So is that better? Good. Okay, so in late October 1863, Refugio Ruiz de Amador was sitting in her Las Cruces home holding Amelia, and she reads this letter. My mother says to send her everything you have to sew so we can do it for you. This gesture of helping a new mother with her mending is not surprising. You probably have had female relatives help you when you had a child, if you're a female in this room. Despite the recently created international boundary, the women in this family wanted to help their relative on the other side with her domestic responsibilities. And this is the larger question in my book, is how does the implementation of the US-Mexico border in Arizona and New Mexico affect domestic relationships? How does it change how Spanish-Mexican women in the territorial period understand their domesticity? And the central concerns that I propose in this chapter and tonight is that for Refugio and her sister Concepcion, the concern was keeping their houses together, doing domesticity, not a political line on the map. And why is that? Well, one, to really understand the domestic practices of my example for tonight, the Amadors, but of Spanish-Mexican women in Doña Ana County during the territorial era, we have to zoom out and back, and we have to zoom back to the Spanish colonial period. And that is because this region has always been linked to El Paso del Norte and even further south via what is called regional networks. And additionally, my research is trying to do multiple things. I'm a complicated historian. I'm a trained US women's historian and a Mexican women's historian. And those two fields never talk to each other. Where do they talk to each other though in the nation? right here, right? And so my book is trying to force US history to recognize that before this place was part of the United States, it was Mexican, and it was also Spanish, and it was indigenous. And so if we're going to understand people's lives, we can't start in 1848, right? We have to look back. And so my work, and this is larger things that I'm doing, is I'm taking the domestic practices of in this chapter, the Amador women, and blowing them up and putting them into a larger context. I'm going to give you a few examples of how I'm doing that tonight. So one of the things I propose in my book is that Spanish and Mexican history doesn't stop after US annexation. Often how even Las Cruces is written about is Las Cruces was developed when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed in 1848. And if you know anything about this place, that's not true. And additionally, cultural practices didn't stop the day the treaty was signed, right? People didn't give up their practices. So I propose in my book that when we study women and their domestic practices, we have to actually look back and say, what did they carry forward into this new nation with them, right? What did they carry with them? The two things I'm talking about tonight are practices of social networking and kinship practices. And the two things I'm talking about are things that are specific to Mexican gender roles and that actually really challenge how we understand women's lives in New Mexico versus, say, the East Coast, because it doesn't look the same. In the rest of the book, I talk about how it makes us rethink the Border Patrol, how it makes us actually rethink the US-Mexico border, the railroad, and I'm gonna give you a little bit of that tonight. Women's seamstress businesses, and also customs enforcement. But the two things I want to focus on tonight is social networking and kinship practices in the region. So why do I care about this? Well, for Refugio Ruiz de Amador to get that letter and to really make sense of send me all that you have to sow, we have to know two things. One, that she was bound up in a relationship of kin, right? Her sister wanted to help her and was willing to ignore an international boundary or didn't even care that there was an international boundary there, right? And two, that clearly there was some network that would allow her to get those goods sent down, right? So what I argue in this chapter 2 of my book, is that regional networks and kin work were actually part of the lived reality of the Mesilla Valley long before it became American. And we can't talk about this valley as if it started all of a sudden in 1848. What I blow up in my piece that I'm giving you a little taste of tonight is that Spanish-Mexican women's kin work in 1848 was not new. It was actually pretty common in this region. Women throughout this area, and I don't just look at the Amadors, I look at the Armijos, the Ochoas, etc., to kind of document the Bacas that this is all going on throughout this area. But tonight I'll focus on the Amadors. And what I argue is that the Amador household was indicative of this regional extended family network that linked the northern frontier of Mexico, right, to the center of Mexico and up to Santa Fe via the Camino Real. And so when we talk about the Camino Real as a trade network, we also have to remember it's a domestic network. It's a network in which family relations are traded. And why is that? Well, how are you going to get any information from your family members? Via the trader who's carrying the mail on the trade network, right? How are you going to get maybe cultural goods from Mexico that allow you to express your affinity for your culture via that trade network, right? So we can't separate what I argue is economic goods from cultural identity and also from domestic identity. As you guys know, because you guys live here, Mesilla and Las Cruces are often described as newer communities that arose in the tumult of the US-Mexico War. I say that this view of the Twin Villages obscures that the Mesilla Valley actually has very strong Spanish and Mexican era connections. And also one of the things that I think, because state lines have erased our memory, is El Paso was part of New Mexico, right? It was part of the Spanish province of New Mexico. And there were very strong connections from Santa Fe to El Paso long before it became part of the United States. In fact, the Mesilla Valley along the Camino Real served as rest stops, ranches, grazing lands long before it was platted and became villages and marked national boundaries. The valley has always served as a vital crossroads along the Camino Real, connecting the northern villages of Taos, Santa Fe, Albuquerque to the interior of New Spain, and then subsequently Mexico. And in fact, the Camino Real de Adentro is the biggest and the most frequently used of the 4 royal roads, but today it gets the least attention. Does anybody know which Camino Real gets the most attention? PCH in California. That's the one that everybody, you know, the one that has all the missions, the 21 missions. But this one, during the Spanish and Mexican area, was the one that had the heaviest traffic and was the most used. But we often, in US history, we don't talk about it that way. In Mexican history, they do talk about it that way. And what I do in my larger project is I actually trace how in territorial New Mexico, Spanish Mexican women continued the Spanish and Mexican practice of using the Camino Real. The other thing that I want to be clear of is actually the Camino Real is a south to north series of trails. It's not a north to south, it's a south to north, which is an important thing if we want to rethink US history, right? It's a south to north movement, and I often tell my students that because they always think that when we think of movement in our country, we think east to west, north to south, right? And additionally, it's not original to Spain. It actually mirrors the Aztec Empire's Pochteka trails. And these are long distance professional merchants called Pochteka, who traveled from Tenochtitlan all the way north to Casas Grandes in present day Chihuahua. Then from there, the Pochteka trails connected to Tiwa, Tewa, Pero, and Caras footpaths up to the Rio Grande Valley. And when the Spanish conquistadors come through, what do? They map their royal road on top of indigenous footpaths and take it over. And by 1780, the Camino Real is continuously in use between Mexico City and Santa Fe. And the artery connecting Santa Fe to Chihuahua becomes known as the Chihuahua Trail. And it's a 40-day trip during the Spanish period by 2-wheel ox cart. And one of the things that comes up is this identity, because the Spanish villages of New Mexico are very sparsely settled, and there's a lot of distance. I mean, even today, right? There's a lot of distance across New Mexico. And so this becomes a very important artery. And scholars have argued that this road not only links people for trade, but it creates social and kin networks. How many people know that there's the Armijos here, there are Mijos in Albuquerque, there are Mijos in Santa Fe? Do you see that kin network? People send them to other trade places, the Bacas, etc., right? So not only are they trading goods, but ideas and cultural practices. The santos, the different wood carvings are sent up, and it's a way to link long distance communities. And it ends up being called the vecino identity, your neighbor. Even though you're far away, it's known as the vecino identity. So you called yourself a vecino, a neighbor, even if you lived far from these people. And so the Camino Real is not just a trade network, it's also a network of kin. And this stays this way even with Mexican independence. And interestingly, with Mexican independence, it gets renamed, but we don't call it that. It gets renamed the National Road. We still call it the Camino Real, right? That just tells us how much it was ingrained in local communities. Then with Mexican independence, what happens is during the Spanish period, the Spanish crown says no foreigners can trade without our permission. In 1821, they say, okay, Santa Fe traders can trade with select families who control the importation of goods, such as the Amadors, the Armijos, the Bacas, who have stores in all of these places, right? So again, it's kin and business tied together. It's not separate at any point. And from the Spanish period through the US, trains of carretas carry goods and carry ideas. And I say that they impress the ruts of a regional identity. They create this idea of the Hispanidad, right, in this region that links northern and southern areas. And how do we know that? Well, anthropologists and archaeologists have found that in New Mexico, certain products were sold here called efectos del país, local products. And in fact, the Mexican government said if you lived in New Mexico and you bought goods from other New Mexicans, you didn't have to pay any import taxes on it, right? Because they knew it's part of this local economy, and it facilitates the development of a local regional identity. So by the end of the mid-18th century, not only is the Camino Real a trade network, it's a network of family-based regional identity, allowing people a long distance to maintain kin connections. So this is important for the Amadors because this is the same path that they're following. Additionally, the Camino Real is also the trail that Stephen Watts Kearney is going to use to take over New Mexico, right? He tramples down it all the way into Chihuahua. It's not an original trail, and he goes down. So why do I explain so much about this trail? Well, during the territorial era, when Spanish Mexican women like the Amadors were doing their kin work, the kin work that I'm about to describe, they weren't doing something new. They were reproducing a heritage of the region, but it looks surprising to us because we think that this is a brand new culture, right? And a brand new community, but we have to put it back in the Spanish and Mexican historical context. So let's go back to the Refugio and the Amadors. The Amadors actually have a really strong ties to the Mesilla Valley long before she moves here in 1863. In 1790, Refugio Ruiz de Amador's maternal great-grandfather, Francisco Garcia de Noriega, was granted the earliest private land claim in the Mesilla Valley, the Santa Teresa Grant. A small part of the grant was bequeathed to Refugio's maternal grandmother. Then Juan Antonio Garcia de Noriega in 1805 settled Bracito, 10 miles south of Las Cruces. And the Bracito land grant ends up becoming the mail exchange stop on the Chihuahua Trail. It becomes the place where these women can get their letters, right? Then in 1839, the Mexican government sets up the Doña Ana Bend Colony Grant with Jose Maria Costales. And this land grant spread from present-day Las Cruces all the way to El Paso del Norte. And it was mostly settled by people from El Paso del Norte. And Refugio's future husband, Martin, moves up onto that grant as a child with his mother, Doña Maria Josefa Gregoria Rodela de Amador, and his siblings. And he comes and he's part of this grant, and he actually lives in the Costales homes the first few times that he's here. So again, this is not an 1848 phenomenon. He's here before this, and his wife's family is here before 1848. Martin witnesses the transition from Mexican to US control at the age of 10. In 1846, he stands in the Doña Ana Plaza as US troops forcefully congregate residents to take an oath of allegiance to the United States. And in fact, Martin's naturalization is continuously disputed. After the war, his mother establishes a business in 1850, And she also remarries 2 times at this time. And she marries a farmer, and the farmer keeps farming and she opens a business. And Martin helps his mother with her business, and he starts participating in the Santa Fe Trail trade, right? Because he's got connections to El Paso del Norte, right? He can follow this regional network and he can be part of this larger extended kin network. So the farm and the merchant business he inherited from his mother, which would become the center or the foundation of what we think of the Amador family, actually comes from his mother and has roots in the Mexican period. And in 1861, he takes over his mother's business, which now reaches up the Santa Fe Trail. That's also the same year that the Civil War breaks out, and the Texan Confederates begin to dominate the valley. It's also the same time that he marries Refugio Ruiz, which a newspaper describes her as a Juarez young lady. And he marries her in El Paso del Norte. And this marriage is really important. He marries into a very well-established Chihuahua trading family. So it's not a coincidence that Juan Ruiz, her father, marries her to Martin, which is connected to Santa Fe trade, when she's the daughter of a Chihuahua trader, right? It's maintaining this trade network. So let me tell you a little bit about Refugio. Refugio Ruiz was born in El Paso del Norte in 1848. Her father, Juan Ruiz, is a well-known merchant. Her mother was the granddaughter of Don Francisco Garcia de Noriega. Does anybody know anything about the Garcia de Noriegas in Chihuahua? Largest hacendados, landowners in the country of Mexico up until the presidency of Porfirio Diaz. This family is well established, right? So this is a very, very strategic marriage here. The Garcia de Noriega family had ranching and cattle grazing land from the Spanish period that stretched from northern Chihuahua to the Santa Teresa Grant in present-day Mesilla Valley. So again, it's not a new connection. When she moved here in 1863, her family was already connected to this area. Additionally, Refugio's maternal ancestors included refugees from the 1680 Pueblo Revolt who resettled in El Paso del Norte by escaping down the Camino Real, right? So she's gonna follow that path too. Martin and Refugio's marriage begins as a trans-border relationship because of the war, and he travels between Las Cruces and El Paso del Norte while growing the business, and he grows it so far that he links it to St. Louis. And because of the Civil War, Refugio stays in Chihuahua. So their marriage starts as a trans-border relationship system that has already been in place for hundreds of years. And in 1863, she gives birth to their first child in El Paso del Norte, Amelia. And she, in fact, doesn't permanently establish herself in Las Cruces until after the birth of Amelia and after Texan Confederates retreated from the valley. And it's not until August 1863 that Refugio and Amelia cross the border to begin keeping house. And that's what the government called what women did at the time, keeping house. And so she comes to Las Cruces, and Las Cruces is actually not much different from where she's from. When she comes to Las Cruces in 1863, it's a small Spanish-speaking village, mostly originating from Chihuahua, particularly the El Paso del Norte district. So she's not going to a foreign community. After marrying and relocating, they actually focused together on the commercial business. I argue this in my book that this business would not have been successful without her and the marriage. And while Martin Amador operates his freighting and wholesale business that goes all the way down to Chihuahua City, Santa Fe, St. Louis, and Silver City, Refugio, I argue, keeps a very distinct and private network which was focused on letter writing, care packages, holiday celebrations, sewing, housekeeping, and social gatherings to maintain her kin identity. And this is the region I'm talking about for this regional network of kin work. And this is Las Cruces, right, when she gets here. I don't know why it's going back. Hold on. There we go. So Refugio, part of her kin work is she's regularly corresponding with her family members and female friends. And as Dennis knows, I've spent over a decade going through all of these letters, all the women's letters, because they're amazing. But one of the things that I wanted to get a sense of is, what did domesticity look like? And this letter I love, Concepcion, her sister, writes to Refugio in September 1863. And this letter, it's one of the, there's like 2 letters that I quote for in a big chunk in my book, because it's the pacing and the depth of it that you need that sense of that intimacy across the distance. So let me read this to you. I won't forget you if I see something nice. I send greetings from my chona, my aunt, my uncle, my cousin, Doña Jesusita, and I send Amelia many kisses. My cousin Paloma says congratulations. I ask you not to forget to send me a copy of the prayer for my cousin Gregoria's Saints Day. Don't forget to write me whenever you can and tell me about Amelia. Tell me if you do not go to Mass and when you're coming to visit, and if you already live alone with a separate kitchen. Right? The intimacy in this letter is very clear. The sisters are living on different sides of an international border, but they have an intimate connection of informal chatter, detailed questions, and personalized greetings. I argue in my book, using anthropological studies of Mexican gender roles, that this reflects the gendered labor of kinship that traveled across not only thresholds to the doors of houses, but also international borders. So what is this? Well, anthropologists have studied family structures in the United States and in Mexico, and they agree that they look different. And in 19th century Mexican families, the family concept was something called the 3-generation grand family, which is different than our nuclear family, right? And what is the 3-generation grand family? It's your parents, your siblings, your spouse, and your children, okay? And you are obligated to be part of them. And in fact, if you look at the correspondence of the Amador collection, it matches this. These are the people who are writing as this grand family. Membership in a Mexican grand family carries obligations of ritual, economic, and social support. Again, the kin and the economic connections are tied together. And this ritual of economic and social support is not only amongst your nuclear relatives, but also your distant relatives. And this is what's very different from American society. In this familial bond, compared to Anglo family structures, an individual is simultaneously and permanently a member of 2 grand families, that of their father and their mother. And how do they maintain this? Well, other anthropologists say this is called kin work. And so what is that? Well, kin work is the work of maintaining the connections of families across multiple households. It's the conception, the maintenance, and the ritual celebration of cross-household kin ties. And it's something that I think we all take for granted, but I always think about like Thanksgiving. How does your Thanksgiving dinner get organized? Usually some of the women in the family are texting or making the phone calls, right? That is work, that is labor. And that is what we mean by kin work. So kin work includes the act of visiting, communicating, sending cards and gifts, organizing holiday gatherings, supporting family members financially, economically, or in court, and that's called confianza in Spanish and Mexican societies. And additionally, it's not just the acts you do, but it's the emotional energy behind these actions. And I think we see that in these letters. So kin work is obligatory in Mexican society, and it's tied to religion, social and political and economic rituals. And correspondence, ooh, I just broke the world. Let me fix it. Any questions on kin work? Does that make sense, that concept? Okay. It's interesting because when I teach kin work, all my students and people are like, oh, yeah, that makes sense, but I never thought about that. And what I'm doing in this project is trying to basically say we can't divorce kin work from economic labor, right? We can't separate it. So the work that Refugio does, connecting her families, allows Martine to be successful as a businessman, right? And we'll see how that happens. Correspondence is central to Refugio's kin work. She extensively writes letters, always in Spanish, to her larger regional family, not just her immediate family, but friends and other communities, distant relatives, etc. And additionally, her daughters write to their extended family. In these letters, they trade gossip, news, prayers, details on who was sick, and requests for goods, right? They mix that religious obligation, that health, and then economic all at the same time. When they were apart, even for a day, Refugio's daughters wrote to each other and their mother to share news. For example, in 1886, Tilly, the daughter Tilly, is visiting Amelia, who at this point is living in Old Albuquerque with her husband, Jesus Garcia, in the Armijo house. Think about those business connections there. Living in the Armijo house, and Tilly's visiting, and Refugio writes down with some family news, and I love this letter. Your little sister Karina is very fat, and she laughs a lot. And Julieta is very skinny and remembers you a lot. I hope that when you come, you will be very fat and tan. Amelia, if Tilly is sad and wants you to come alone, send her to the driver and I will receive her here, right? Why do you think I like this quote? Any thoughts? How does it make me think of the Camino Real in a new way? Anything shocking about it? Tilly's not old. Yeah, she can be sent alone, right? This tells me that there is a connection here, right? They trust a driver. They trust the ability to travel on this trail. How do we often talk about in the United States of the Camino Real? Apache depredations, right? This is a different vision. This is a very different idea. And it's very clear that she feels safe during the so-called Victorian period, sending her daughters to another city because it's going along this merchant train, right? In this caravan, it's part of her heritage. I particularly love this letter because not only do we see the bond that between females, but within 2 lines, we learn that in 1886, women were traveling alone along long distances in New Mexico. Additionally, when the family was traveling to Mexico, they went to Mexico a lot, and I'm going to give you some details on why they could go to Mexico a lot. Maria often wrote to her mother, sharing gossip. And this is one of the famous letters from the collection. She's in Juarez. She goes to a dance. She actually goes to a dance. It's really fun. And she takes a carriage ride around the city at night. And the next day she reports it to her mother. And I like this line. And she says, Doña Conchita Ochoa is very ill with dysentery from eating too much chili con queso. And Doña Lolita McGoffin has indigestion from her chili con queso and elotes. Anything you notice about those last names? Business merchant families, right? So they're not just trading with these people, they're socializing with these people. And again, that's why they feel safe going to these areas. Tilly frequently visited Amelia too in Old Albuquerque, and they would often plan their trips in their correspondence. And in September 1893, the 2 sisters, Tilly and Amelia, are planning a trip up to Albuquerque so Tilly can visit her. And Amelia writes back to Tilly down in Las Cruces saying this: I received your little letter and we'll be very happy to have you come to the fair. I asked Doña Josefita Armijo if there's room next to the living room, and there they can put a bed for you. Where Julieta sleeps, you can sleep. And as for the food, you can eat with us. I think the Stevensons are coming, as Doña Simona wrote to me asking about the prices. Julieta is very happy to know you are coming. Julieta's up visiting. Julieta Amador's up visiting. Again, there's so many details in this, but as a historian of gender and trade and labor, what can I extract? Well, one, I'm very happy to receive your letter. That is not just an affection, but that's kin work. They have to plan their visits. They have to plan how they're going to see each other. They have to plan their socialization. But there's also links between merchant families. There are Mijos, the Stevensons. They're planning entertainment activities. And my favorite thing is no men are involved in this trip, right? No men are involved. Additionally, when her mother was away from the Mesilla Valley, Maria often kept her family up on the news. In May 1896, she reported the gossip. And that is that a friend, Pancho or Francisco Amador, went to Chihuahua and that they go crazy with the girls. And Francisco was particularly interested in Gringa that night. And Maria continued, Dr. Ignacio told Pancho that he knew that he had gone to see the señorita. They had gone to see, and he had seen the two of them sitting in the garden. So not only is these letters full of planning, but it's also full of gossip and chat of their larger social circle. And we get a sense that these daughters are not alone, right? And they're not isolated. They're experiencing a very social life. These letters demonstrate that the women are deeply involved in maintaining extended relationships and community ties in both Las Cruces, El Paso del Norte, and even Albuquerque. And one letter, I think, there's many letters, but this is the one I think does it very succinctly, shows how important this gendered work of kinship actually worked. In the summer of 1895, Maria is 20 and Tilly is 15. They travel with two sisters from the Laredo Academy down to Mexico City, where Refugio's family lives. And their trip included a visit to the shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe and a visit to the wife of President Porfirio Diaz. While in Mexico City, they also paid a visit to Refugio's cousin. And the next day, Tilly reports to her mother in a letter in 1885 about this visit. Yesterday at 4:30 in the afternoon, we went to see cousin Luz. She was overjoyed to meet us. We also met Luce and Sisto, who are grown boys now. Luce said that he had known at once that I was the same one in the pictures from our first communion. And so the only way that Luce knew who Tilly was because of that kin work of letter writing and sending the pictures down, right? So these letters speak to how the Amador and Ruiz women were deeply involved in maintaining extended relationships that tied Las Cruces to El Paso del Norte, to Mexico City, and to Albuquerque. These allowed them to keep social bonds that were also economic bonds. And while these letters could not change international politics, they could support regional kin relationships that disregarded political constructions of nations. And how do I know this? There we go. So one of the things I did, you can't see it because it's near impossible to see, is in the decade that I've worked with this, I tracked every single time the women crossed the border, and I had to stop because they did it so much. And how I did this is I tracked their travel across the border in multiple ways. Every time they mentioned in a letter their trips, their beginning and end dates of trips, I tracked it, and I have this timeline that I used. And there's multiple data sets. And those lines are multiple data points. That just tells you it's chaos. And I had to stop. This isn't even all the trips. I had to stop because it became ridiculous. Additionally, what I did is not only was it the letters, I also looked at social columns. So in newspapers at the time, social columns would report who was in town and what hotels they were staying at. And so I'd use those to figure out who traveled where. And examining newspapers and the correspondence just to Refugio. Oops, that's that. Not to anybody else, right? Between 1863 and 1907, I tracked each time any of the Amador girls crossed the border. It became impossible for me to document the exact number of trips because the women were crossing so frequently that it was actually puzzling to figure out the beginning and end dates of trips for how fast they were going back and forth. And one of the things that I say in my larger project is it's not due to a lack of sources, because a lot of people say, we don't have documents on women crossing the border. We do, it's just that they're doing it so much that it's hard for us to keep track. The Amador children, as they grew older, regularly moved across the border and throughout the territory. The women often traveled with each other, with friends, or alone. Some days the visits lasted for a day or two, others lasted for a month or a few years. And many of these visits were not purely social, but also domestic, extending the reaches of kin work. And I call this transborder domesticity. In my project, I really dig into this, of how they help each other with chores. And I'll just give you a few tastes of this. I actually categorized every trip in different ways. Like, what did it look like? Was it for entertainment? Was it for trade? Was it for medical reasons? And was it for domesticity? And the most frequent form of travel I found is what I categorize as transborder domesticity. And that is crossing to help family members complete very simple domestic work, including sewing, cleaning, childcare, and cooking. The women often traveled to help each other with housekeeping, sent lists of chores to be cleaned, completed, and carried domestic wares across the border. For instance, in January 1864, Concepcion traveled from El Paso del Norte north to Las Cruces, so Refugio and Amelia could go down to El Paso del Norte. And Concepcion came up to manage the house for her. Okay. During this visit, Concepcion oversaw the cooking and Refugio's sewing projects and managed the Amador's domestic laborers. Also, Refugio could go down and see her mother. Additionally, female kin regularly came up from Chihuahua to help Refugio and her daughters complete. This aunt came up from El Paso del Norte multiple times in that month to can apple jelly and peach preserves from the fruit in the family's orchards. And so when they did this, they were doing very mundane tasks. And one of the things that stood out to me, I'm a borderlands historian, is the border's not mattering. It doesn't matter at this time, right? And that's really important, because how do we think of the border today? That's not how we think of the border, right? And this really gave me a different image of the border in the 19th century, to cross the border to do very mundane tasks in a way that we can't do today, okay? So when the Amador women visited El Paso del Norte, they often found this very frustrating, the daughters especially. And there are some good letters. This is the one that's the most concise. Maria was really frustrated in this one letter in December 1891, and she writes to her mom, and she's basically like, are you gonna be here while I'm still here? Or like, are you gonna come down while I'm still here? Because I don't like when you're not here with me. There are more chores to do when I'm here alone. There are not as many chores when you are there. And then she goes on and describes it basically like, you're the favorite daughter, and so they don't make us kids of the favorite daughter do the chores. It's a really good letter. But this really tells us that domesticity was central to these family connections. Additionally, Refugio regularly directed her housekeeping and offered domestic advice to her daughters from either side of the line. There are extended periods of time that perhaps there's domestic discord in the family, and Refugio is in El Paso del Norte for a very long time, and she's sending advice up to her daughters. And usually Amelia or Maria took over the housekeeping, and she would write these letters with just instructions on what to do. For example, in June 1894, Refugio is on an extended trip to Juarez, and a series of letters she tells Maria, give me the household status. Here's the household tasks that I need you to do. Here's the bills I need you to pay. And the daughters were often happy to help. Maria was once visiting friends in Juarez and wrote to her mother that if Refugio needed help, she would just cross. And she wrote, tell me how you're feeling, and if you are not well, I will come because I would be very sorry if you were in the kitchen and you got sick because I did not cross. And as I was going through these letters, the first time I went through them, there were two words I was looking for. And that was cross and the line or the border. Because I was trying to think about how they were imagining. This is one of the few times I actually find the word cross in the correspondence. And that is because the border doesn't matter to these daughters. It's not inhibiting them. It's really their social obligations. Why is that? Oh, because of the shared screen, you can't see it. That's fine. Why is that? Well, when we think of the US-Mexico border today, we think of it as heavily policed. And we have to put ourselves in late 19th century US-Mexico border. Shortly after US annexation, and until 1917, the US-Mexico border was not policed for Mexican immigration. Okay? It's not policed for that. Mexicans are allowed to freely go across the border. And that's why these women can cross this border so freely. In fact, between El Paso del Norte and Yuma, Arizona, the border enforcement has 18 mounted men. That's the area that they are enforcing, right? So it's not the same border that we have today. There's not consistent enforcement. In fact, there's actually not the concrete delineation of a US-Mexico border. And in fact, like the Mexican government and the United States were until 1896 are still trying to figure out exactly where the border is. And so women at this time did not necessarily worry about crossing the border when it came to legality, political borders, political barriers, or the costs. The women in the correspondence rarely mentioned the border itself in the correspondence. The few times that I found the border or the line or crossing was flooding, time-consuming chores, late wagons, or illnesses that prevented them from crossing, right? It's not border patrol, it's not police, it's not immigration, it's not customs. And I find this very important because in 2023, and when I had started this project in 2011, between then, the border is often talked about as this heavily policed and barricaded space. This really allows us to rethink this. There's a glaring lack of descriptions of border enforcement or even any hesitation to travel across the border. The main worries for the women were waiting for a train to carry them over, avoiding the flooding of the Rio Grande, or figuring out the train schedule. And in fact, the Amadors in Juarez, when they have a few properties, some houses in Juarez, they cross the border so freely that they have a mailbox in El Paso del Norte. And they go check their mail in El Paso del Norte. Why is this? Well, the US-Mexico border until 1917 has no fences or crossing enforcement. There are no customs checkpoints. If there are, they're usually a few miles from the actual political line itself. Additionally, women did not face customs enforcement. Why do you think that is? What's the assumption about what women are doing in the 19th century or not doing? They're not business people, right? So we don't need to check them to see if they're bringing up in goods that need to be part of import taxes. Surprise, surprise, they were hiding things in their dresses. And even the Amadors, go read my book, were putting things in their suitcases that they were then selling, but because of the gendered idea of labor and what is economic labor and what is women's labor, they weren't paying an import tax. So these women took advantage of this engraved regional tradition of freely crossing this area to travel and challenge a new national boundary. And in fact, another thing that my research with the Amadors has challenged is there's this story that when the railroad came to New Mexico, it is the moment that New Mexico became truly American. That's the quote, okay? Not when I look at the Amadors, okay? And why is that? Well, in fact, the railroad actually allowed the daughters to travel to Mexico more, right? And they're able to buy more products from Mexico, okay? So this becomes important. By 1881, when the first passenger train arrives in Las Cruces, the number of recorded trips by the Amador women spikes suddenly. The Las Cruces train station is a half a mile from the Amador home, and the Amador boarding house and freighting business transforms to become part of this business. What do we know about regional networks at this time in Mexican society? They're attached to families. So if the business is going to reorient, the family's also going to reorient to the train. So after 1881, Martin refocuses his work looking at the train station. Additionally, the Amador women refocus their travel on the railway. This simplified the family's ability to travel and send items through the New Mexico territory and down to Chihuahua. And in fact, the increased movement of the Amadors actually allows them to get deeper and deeper into Mexico at this time. So while the trains from the east to the west brought increased travel, it also more intricately connected New Mexico to Mexico. And why do we know that? Well, the route of the railroad follows what? The Camino Real, right? It follows the Camino Real. And additionally, the Mexican Central Railroad, which is built at the same time, follows the Camino Real into Mexico, right? It's not a coincidence. Like government planning, there's a reason behind this, right? They know that these are successful routes. So as the United States is building their rail lines, Mexican President Porfirio Diaz implements a massive railroad construction project to take the Camino Real and have the train go parallel to it. So while the railroad did facilitate US expansion, it also facilitates connections to Mexico and eases the movement of people and kin across the border. Let me wrap up. What's the point of this all? Well, we have to be careful when we talk about Las Cruces, Doña Ana County, and remember, we have to remember to put it in a regional context. And that regional context includes not just US history, but also Spanish and Mexican history. The Amador and the Ruiz women's domesticity ensured the social reproduction of their family and allowed them to have strong kin and cultural connections. In fact, majority of her children marry people from Chihuahua or have connections from Chihuahua, and even Frank Campbell lived in Chihuahua for a while. So this family has a very strong connection to Chihuahua, and it's not a brand new connection. The work of cooking, cleaning, and sewing cannot be ignored in our larger understanding of the creation of the US-Mexico border. While this is a unique phenomenon, this is a territorial phenomenon, it's going to change after 1917. Women are able to take advantage of limited border enforcement and establish regional networks to maintain connections to Mexico after US annexation. And so in the intimate work of kinship, I argue, multiple boundaries get broken down. The boundaries between the United States and Mexico, the boundaries between communities, El Paso, Las Cruces, Albuquerque, and the boundaries between separate households. In fact, kinship allows the women to bridge these boundaries and allows the families to stay together despite the separation. I'm done. Questions? Yes.
I wonder if you found that Martin, in this industry, he sort of inherited and developed, found that fabric was one of the best things to move. I mean, in terms of like price per pound.
Oh, yeah.
The value added from the women's labor in particular.
Um,
Other fabrics were part of his trade, the family's trade.
yes, I'm gonna be careful with my answer because I don't know if he knew that it was added value, but he mostly, I mean, that's mostly what he trades in. It's actually, I was telling Dennis, I left off the key part of my book, which is the women actually have their own fabric selling business and they're trading items, and that's what they're hiding in their suitcases. Yeah, and part of it is what's really interesting is because it is seen as women's domestic wares, they're not charged import taxes. And so in larger economic studies, how we understand this allows Refugio to support the family because she can sell it and increase the family's profits without paying an import tax in a way that Martine would have to pay. And actually what's really interesting is just the other day I walked into the archive and I'm working on another project. I'm looking at matriarchs of transporter businesses. And who am I looking at? The Armijos. And I started looking at Nicholas Armijo's letters, and I opened up the first folder, kid you not, and the first letter is Nestor Armijo writing to Nicholas Armijo complaining about the import taxes. And I just started laughing, so I'm like, I never found that in the women's stuff, right? And that just tells me right away, right? But yeah, fabric, I've taken it out. You have to go read the book. But the items that are traded the most are fabric, some goods, domestic wares, religious items are traded the most. And in fact, when you look at what people write to Refugio to buy versus Martine, they're mostly going to her to get clothing. And I think it's because one, she makes dresses. And in fact, surprise, I'll give it away. You guys are the secret audience. She has a dressmaking business that she runs out of the house, that she runs with her sisters. And it's very clear she has a dressmaking business. And there's letters that are letters that are literally like, change this, do this, here's the sizes. So-and-so wants this cut this way, this fabric, etc. And it's not just a dressmaking business across the border, but they're sending the pieces to be finished back and forth. Finish the hem. One of the things that I usually open with is there's this one letter that says like, hey, I'm sending you this because the size of the hems in Las Cruces that you could buy are better than the size of down in El Paso, right? Yeah, fabric is amazing. That's where my next. It is so well, and it's so fascinating. I can keep going. So the reason it's so fascinating is at the time in the United States, it's the rise of ready-to-wear. And what I argue in my project is this is a way for these Spanish Mexican women to maintain their identity because they can design their clothing in a fashion that represents their identity as ready-to-wears arising. So yeah, it's super. It's like, it's so fascinating. And actually, if you go look at the letters, you can see little pieces of fabric. Yeah, it's so fascinating. So I'm obsessed with it. Yeah.
I have two questions. So your research kind of is like before the train and after the train, and you make the case that the train expedites the movement of especially women across the border. I'm just kind of curious, before the train, do any of the women have like their own buggies and are they their own drivers and are they moving themselves, or are they still, is that still part of?
They're not their own drivers, not long distance. Locally, yes. Long distances, and it's another really fun thing about the correspondence is they literally are like, what's it called, like hitchhiking almost, not, but like with friends, like so and so is going to be going somewhere, take the buggy with them, kind of thing. Or a lot of the military caravans. If a military caravan's going through, they'll travel with the military caravans. And part of that is because Amelia is married to someone in the government And I think, so then they know people, and then there's traders, and I actually get into this. They have a lot of connections with government people, which I think is another reason they kind of turn their back when they're crossing the border, right? So long distances, they're going in either trade caravans, or they're going in military, like government and military caravans. And part of this is because Martin, when he is a young kid, begins his first job is actually in the Santa Fe trade, and he's got connections in the Santa Fe trade all the way to St. Louis. In fact, that's why the boys go to school in St. Louis. Yeah, does that answer your question? And part of the reason I have the train thing is one of the comments I got was, the train changes everything in New Mexico, and I was like, it's going to facilitate things, right? So yeah, I have the before and the after train, because especially if you know Las Cruces, you know Martin is attached to the train, right? The arrival of the train. And so we can't make this blanket statement about the arrival of the train in Mexican society. And so I wanted to give this hyper local thing and make a larger statement. What was your next one?
The other one has to do with the telegraph, since the train expedites the movement of people very quickly across the border. I get the sense that it's a matter of hours as opposed to probably days with the bug. Is there a spike in correspondence with the telegraph? If we have a lot of the telegraphs, or is a lot of your work is showing it's just mostly written letters, but
oh no, there's type, there's handwritten, there's telegraph. There is a spike. There's especially a spike coming, well, from all directions. I would say more the trade letters. There's a spike. No, there's a spike. Period. And I mean, what's really fascinating is actually there's letters that are sent that are like, you haven't responded to the letter I sent yesterday. Yeah, things like that, right? Because they're being sent so often, or they'll not staple, but they'll put another letter in the envelope saying, I wrote this morning, but I didn't get a chance to give it to so-and-so, which also gives me a sense of like what their domesticity actually look like, which is, I can talk about in another chapter, like why they're able to pause to write letters. But yeah, no, there's a total spike, and also the letters, some of them become shorter, but when it comes to the women to women letters, they still maintain this kin relationship of always having a religious salutation, always talking about family and health, right? Always some business relation, and compared to like their business letters. And they usually maintain handwritten, even like some of the typed letters that I can think of, there's like handwriting, like one of the daughters, you know which one it is? Like practice typing, and then on a typewriter, and then it's like, well, I just want to write. And she like writes on the paper. So yeah, there is a spike. And in fact, like someone once said, like, I don't think in Santa Fe that there was a typewriter in 1886 there, and there were typewriters because they had one. Yeah, a red shirt and a black shirt. Yeah.
I just want to say muchas gracias for doing this history, because the richness of the border really has not been acknowledged. And so you probably, I as one who has those border contacts, cross-border contacts and family,
Yeah.
I really want to thank you for your work and for.
Thank you. Yeah, this was, I tell my grad students in my seminar, this project actually germinated in a very frustrating way. Being from the West, and I went to grad school in Iowa, the way people talk about the border there, really, like, I was like, I mean, I used to cross, like, we'd go get ice cream, right? And things like that. And then it made me really like, someone has to document this lifestyle. So yeah, thank you.
Is there any idea how long it took from Las Cruces to Juarez?
No, I've tried. There are scholars who like do that course, right? I've tried to figure it out, but a lot of it, like depends on things. I'm not a mathematician and things. And so I get the sense, and it also depends. I think the boys tended to travel a little faster. And I think it's because they're literally getting on their horses at some points and going. I know Francisco at some points just gets on his horse and goes. A few hours, two and a half hours, depends. And it actually gets faster depending, because the carts change from 3-wheel to 4-wheel, etc. And also it depends if they're on a military caravan, they're stopping more often, but not long. And it actually, once the train comes, it's not long at all. Yeah. And actually, like they have like little timetables. They're like, I missed the train, I'm gonna get the next one. Yeah. Yeah.
Speaking about facilitating the railroad, I recall reading something about trying to get right away into Las Cruces, and that one of these families basically gave them the land. Did you find any of that?
This one. Amador, yeah, our Amador land. Yeah, he gave land. Some of his land. Some of it is some of the northern portion of it is our Mijo land. So yeah, and that's part of it. And again, like that's why, like knowing this region and hearing someone say, well, the railroad like precipitated Anglo expansion. I'm like they want this. This is going to connect them to Mexico, right? Yeah, he gives land, and in fact, his original property like goes around what it was. Yeah.
Just one more thing. So what's great about this too is that since we're fighting for statehood for 62 years, one of the cool things that I think the Amador family kind of illuminate is the fact that New Mexico, the borderlands, this area is not stagnant. It's probably being betrayed by what being sort of uncivilized, backwards. Or it shows that this community is very, that people are on the move, and that it's very much alive. It's just probably being ignored because of other people.
Yeah, I think that's extremely true and important, and that's actually like the afterword of my book is a lot of this idea of how we talk about Arizona and New Mexico as one of the premises of my book is we talk about the United States coming here and bringing things and assuming that like these practices from the past just like kind of disappeared. And a lot of it is like, well, how can we still see it today? Like, why do we know that these women survived in certain ways, right? How do we still see these things? And part of the reason New Mexico takes so long to get statehood is actually because the Hispanos here were so entrenched in maintaining their regional identity, right? And the US government is like we're not gonna let those people to be part of our government. And it's some of what I talk about in my book is it's mothers like this. The first chapter in my book looks at the role mothers played in teaching their daughters their culture through domestic practices in ways that allowed them to maintain Hispanidad or create Hispanidad so they could be white or indigenous people, right, at this time, in ways that like angered white people. So like doing laundry in the river, which like in Mesilla becomes an ordinance that you can't do laundry in the river because it is seen as something brown people do, right? But the women continue to do it, which tells me things. And it's part of these oral histories from the 1930s and 1940s. And it really tells us that Arizona and New Mexico, mostly the southern portion of Arizona, had a long period of resistance. And so when we think about why they weren't admitted as states, it's not because they were just like backward people sitting there doing nothing. It's that they wanted to maintain their culture during this period. Yeah. Yeah.
When does your book come out?
Right now, either, what is the year? 2023? Either spring 2024 or fall 2024. So, because everything like COVID like messed up all production. So yeah, that's when it's coming out. UNC, University of North Carolina Press. So, a baby. I love it.
10 years of work.
Yeah, well, and that, I mean, some of it is, you know, I knew that this story was here, right? I knew that there's this like rich culture here. I mean, I have another piece where I look at like cooking and like, you know, when we talk about New Mexican food, like why do we still have it? Right? These mothers in these kitchens. So, yeah. Thank you.
Well,
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
I'm gonna let you do your thing. So I'll break it knowing me.
No, you're welcome. Let's see, we just need to do escape.
Hello.
My mother was been so interested in your, and interested in the book. We probably had it was, so she graduated in, you know, stuff. Wasn't sure you would have.
Yeah.